Good afternoon, everyone. This is Professor Bill Seeger. Welcome for another hour of our tax webinar series for corporate education here at University of Texas at Arlington. We are coming to you from our satellite campus, University of Texas at Arlington, Fort Worth, or UTA Fort Worth, as we proudly call it. And we are so thrilled to have a spectacular guest today, Dr. Paula deWitte, and we'll be discussing analytics and technology and risk management, and we'll be talking not only about tax, but other events that have occurred recently, like the pandemic, and talk about risk management and mitigating risk in that context. So once again, thank you, Paula, for taking time out. You're a very busy and important academic professor and practitioner. So thank you for being with us this afternoon.
I'm very happy to be here. I'm a little intimidated because I know nothing about tax. So, if I goof up, be nice.
No, I will not correct you. So you won't goof up. You know more than you think.
It'll be one thing. If you fall off the chair laughing, it'll be, yeah. No.
Well, then we'll certainly stay in those areas where you are stronger then, okay? I just wanted to give a bit of background first about our program. So corporate education is a part of the College of Business. We are here to bring executive education, continuing education to not only our alum, but the community, the Dallas-Fort Worth community. So we are dedicated to that continuing education at an executive level. We also bring the best research of our College of Business faculty to the community in a practical way. We try and break down the research that's been done into actionable elements so that business practitioners can actually use it and apply it. And then finally, like with our COVID-19 series, we try and put information out with regard to the issues of the day to help our community in any way we can. So that's what our mission is. And as part of that mission, we're having our webinar series in tax. And we've got our special guest, as I mentioned, Dr. Paula deWitte. I wanted to give a little background on Paula. Once again, I could spend the rest of the afternoon, but we don't have that much time to discuss her many accomplishments. But I want to introduce her background, and then we will get going on today's presentation. So currently, Dr. deWitte is Associate Professor of Practice at Texas A&M in the Computer Science and Engineering Department. In addition, she is an Adjunct Professor of Law at the Texas A&M Law School. She first got her BS in math at Purdue University in Indiana, if you've forgotten. And she then got her MS in education at Purdue. And then she got her PhD at Texas A&M in computer science. And I guess she was bored, so then she decided to get her JD, her doctorate in law from St. Mary's University School of Law. It's in San Antonio, right,
Yes.
Paula? Okay. So a very accomplished person, but her area of expertise, besides risk, is she's a cybersecurity expert. So that's her reputation, I would say. And so she's learned in artificial intelligence, data analytics, and how all that relates to risk management. And that's will be our discussion today. And we'll talk a little bit about tax. I will not ask her anything that will intimidate her at all, but I can, talk about some tax situations that you can speak to just in general. So with that, I think Dr. Paula, if we give her the screen back, is prepared to tell us, what the heck is risk anyway, Paula? From a technical point of view, people have an opinion about risk. But, from that technical point of view, what is risk? How does it differ from uncertainty? I'll turn you loose to lead us. Thank you.
Okay. So first of all, let me say again how happy I am to be here, and I give you a big Aggie howdy because faculty at A&M, we got to say howdy or we get fired, I guess.
Howdy.
I want to talk about risk, but I want you all to be engaged in this because, as I said, I'm not a tax person. I'm not an accounting person. I'm a technical person from computer science. My life is I had some department head told me last year, boy, we want to be sure you're happy at A&M because you don't seem to be risk averse. You're not afraid of change, which is, as Bill said, I went back to law school I've been licensed about 11 years. Obviously a late life decision because I wanted to build on my technology background and I was kind of aging out of the technology field. So let me just start and, like I said, ask questions. This is who I am. Bill had asked me to give a few minutes about my journey. I grew up on a farm in Indiana. And
Paula, I'm sorry. We don't see your screen. Maybe you're not sharing.
Okay. Let's see.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
You're right. Yeah, and this is after I've said I've got a PhD in computer science. You see how nope, that's not
that way.
Yeah. Why is that not showing up as, okay, I know why. Let me show you. Let me go. Now tell me if you see it now. Do you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. You see who am I?
Not yet. You'll have to, right now, the little thumbprints are on the side. So I don't know if you're going to go to a screen show.
I know hang on. Shoot. Sorry, we had this working earlier. How's that?
Perfect. It's who am I? There you are.
This is what happens just after I say I've got a PhD in computer science. I've got two screens, right? I am a licensed attorney in Texas. Occasionally people ask me why I don't practice. My goal when I went to law school was to build on my technology career, and I have found the perfect place to do that, being rather unique in computer science and law because most lawyers do not have a technical background. This is my current job, Associate Professor of Practice in Computer Science and Engineering at A&M. I also work some out of Galveston because there's some great risk there in maritime cybersecurity and supply chain. And basically, adjunct professor of law. I teach 2 or 3 classes a year. And I focus mostly, as I said, on risk, cybersecurity, law, policy, and ethics. And what draws all this together that I want you to understand is we live in a very risky world. If I were teaching you in my graduate risk class, I always say, how many of you feel like you're experts in risk? And nobody raises their hand. And then I always say, well, you've lived to this age. You've selected coming to A&M. How did you get to school today? Did you drive blindfolded? Did you drive drunk? Did you jump in front of the bus? We don't think about it, but we are constantly dealing with risk. But at the same time, as I kid Bill, in a minute, I'll show you the slide, but when I say what is risk, I don't like the legal definition. It's way too big. Risk is basically probability of a loss. What's the possibility or probability I'm going to have a loss? And there's 4 ways to deal with risk. I can accept it. A lot of times in our lives, we say, hey, there's a risk. I'm going to move and change my job. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm taking a risk. I'm going to accept it. I can avoid it. I can say, I'm afraid to fly, so I'll stay off airplanes. I can mitigate the risk saying I'm going to identify the risk, and then I'm going to figure out how to put in a risk mitigation strategy, understanding that it's never 100%. Or I can transfer the risk, and that sometimes works with risk mitigation, and we typically think of that as insurance. Let me just tell you a quick story. Years ago, I was on a flight from Dallas to Oklahoma City. I'll never forget this. And there was this guy sitting in the middle seat. We were on a Southwest flight, and he looked like he could have been a linebacker, or something. And as we were taking off, he grabs the arm rails of the chair, and he starts saying the Lord's Prayer very loudly as we take off. This is very disconcerting if you're in a plane, right? Does he know something I don't know? We get in the air, and he kind of comes down, and I say to him, are you okay? Do I need to call the flight attendant? Are you going to have a heart attack? Can I buy you a drink? What? Are you afraid to fly? And he said, oh, no, I fly every week. he is somebody that has accepted that risk, right? And for a minute, I had this like wild vision in my head of, and every week you're sitting next to somebody like me that's doing that. But it's a good way for you to understand. You can avoid risk. I don't want to fly. I'm afraid of it. And I'm just using it as an example. I can accept risk. I don't want to fly, but I'll do it. We accept risk every day. We know we're safe drivers. We get in, we use our seatbelt, we have airbags, we do all these things to mitigate risk, but we know that there's still some residual risk, or we can transfer the risk. We have insurance. So this is what I know about risk, and this is kind of a joke, because the more I study risk, and I could show you right now on my table here, I have 8 books on risk, and I'm going through for my fall class in the law school. The more I study risk, it seems like the less I know. Risk has changed, and in one word, COVID-19. Risk has changed in cybersecurity. For years, I taught cybersecurity risk, and I said, here's the risk, here's the controls you put in place, and you can mitigate that risk. Well, about 3 or 4 years ago, I had this epiphany that really wasn't true, because we began to see more cases in cyber risk that caused financial problems, that caused strategic problems, that caused, we knew, operational problems. So Bill asked me to put this slides. I call it Arthur Koch, if you know him, the author, his 3 laws on risk. What's distinguished states that something is possible, he's almost right. When he states something is impossible, he's probably wrong. The only way to discover the limits of the possible is to venture a little past them into the impossible. That's what I feel like we're doing every day, trying to figure out risk. We're trying to look at data analytics that I'll talk a little bit about. We're talking about AI. Of course, everybody says blockchain, blockchain, blockchain. I'm not a big blockchain person. I am a big data analytics person. My entire career, I've worked with data. We'll talk about some of those pitfalls. Let me stop there. Questions? I feel like I'm kind of babbled on. Do we have any questions yet, or?
Well, I have one.
Yes.
The reason I asked you to put like the Clark in here, the Clark's 3 laws, is it just struck me that the Dr. Fauci, let's go to the pandemic, he's up there, he does his thing. To a certain extent, at one time it's airborne, and another time it was surfaces, and another time to mass work. So I wanted you to maybe speak to this learned scientist where the data is shifting potentially, if not minute to minute, it's day to day, week to week, and yet he's got to talk to the public about these risks and what's happening. I think it's a bit of an impossible thing in the public. And here's my question. They get discouraged and they throw their hands up and say, hey, it's, whatever's popular today. I think it leads to some of the bad behavior where people say, I don't really believe it. But can you
100%.
that in terms of the laws?
100%. And you've actually seen this, I think, in some of Thayer and Sunstein's work on nudging,
right?
On how people make decisions, right? At every point in time, he was right. And at every point in time, he was wrong. Right, because he was working with the data at hand. But he was wrong because he was working with the data at hand and he didn't have the complete picture of data. When you drive your car, and I don't know why I'm thinking of a car so much today, but you got that little rear view mirror to tell you where you're coming from, and you got a big windshield telling you where you're going to go. But in fact, trying to predict risk is looking through the windshield, but all we have is what's in the rear view mirror. Right. And so I agree with you. You don't have to wear a mask. Oh, wait, you got to wear a mask. Oh, now masks are mandatory. Can't be put on airborne. It's got to be, or can't get services. Oh, wait, we're wrong. At every point, his data he was operating on the data he had, but it was incomplete. And this is the biggest problem we have as data scientists trying to communicate. Yeah. There's one slide, if you remember when I lectured your class, where how data scientists talk, and they talk in geek speak. Right. I'm doing this table and I've got this R factor and the statistics and this and this. And if you're in a tax accountant and you're going like, I just need the data analytics. Tell me what the answer is. Okay. Right. The answer is 42. How'd you get there? Well, I got this table and so a lot of it's a communication issue in that it's statistics. Let me let me give you an example. My house flooded in Hurricane Harvey. My house was built in 1958. I'm in the flood zone, but the house had never flooded. So I prepared that I would be in the house, but not flood. I did everything they told us to do in Houston. I had water, I had flashlights, I had batteries, I had snacks. My house flooded. Okay. None of those things did any good. I didn't even lose power as 12 to 16 inches of water came into my house, which, let me tell you, is a little scary thing when you realize you got to go out and pull the circuit breaker, right? That's a risk. Right. My rubber boots, it's like, please God, I got to shut off power.
Right.
So it's the same thing that happened to Dr. Fauci. He's got that rear view mirror, and he's trying to tell you from the windshield view. Right. And I don't envy his position because, like I said, at every point in time, he was right and he was wrong. It's kind of like Schrodinger's cat, right? He can go back and claim victory, or they can go back and claim defeat.
My quick follow-up is, so if we start getting, folks like yourself, more focused on the windshield as opposed to the rearview mirror, are the conversations going to be different? Are predictions going to be different? I mean, what hope can you give us if we get the lens, rearranged a bit? What's going to happen?
Here's what I think people miss. His last point: any sufficiently avoided advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Okay.
We've always lived in a world full of data, right? If you read about the Galveston hurricane in whatever year that was, I think it was 1900. If you read about that, we have the same data. We have the same environment today. That hasn't changed. I've been in this field, over 3 decades. Okay. So we always had a lot of data, and we always wanted to predict. That's what you want to do, is predict. To give you an idea, there's a famous computer scientist, Grace Murray Hopper. I heard her speak in the early 80s. By the way, she was the first one that I'd ever heard predict the Y2K issue. But she made a point at that time that at the state of the art was to have, you could predict the weather. But the problem is, prediction came out after the event had occurred.
Yes.
And so she was advocating for special computer hardware and software that you would do that. Now, we don't have that today, and we don't have to, because there's been 3 big developments. We have had cheaper, faster, better hardware. So now we can store all this massive data. We have wonderful software technology that can go through and do a lot of statistical analysis. I was at did a meetup last night at the local software developers out of Bryan College Station, and the guy was differential equations, and he's manipulating all these in a language called Julia to predict who's going to be hit and when in the pandemic. So we've had the hardware and we had the software, but what people miss is there's the third leg of that stool, and that is the advance in mathematics, in statistics, in developing algorithms, graph pattern matching algorithms, all this kind of stuff that we can now do that is in takes those special languages and software and puts that data in hardware. And now if some computer scientist came out and said, well, we can't predict the weather because it takes 3 days to predict an event that's going to happen the next day, it'd be laughed off the stage. And that's what's changed in 40 years, since 1980. And that's what people miss. I did my dissertation in artificial intelligence 30 years ago. There was a big AI was, going to be the big promise, and then it crashed because it oversold. Now there's a resurgence because of the advances in hardware, software, and the mathematical theory. And that's the part people just think, hey, we got all this cheap hardware. You can buy all this stuff. We can keep all this data. And we've got this software. What do you do when you put it together? Well, the algorithms are how you put it together.
Right. No, that's great. Thank you.
And that gets missed. I hope that answered your question.
It did. Fantastic.
So what the more I study risk, the less I seem to know about it. What I've learned in the past year or two that's changed the way I teach and how I approach risk is this whole notion of enterprise risk. And there's 3 major things: classic risk management, strategic, financial, and operational. Strategic means, what are you going to do? Stephen Jobs was a genius at this. What's the vision? What's my strategy? The financial, am I going to be able to afford to do it? And operational, can I do it? And if any of those fail, it doesn't matter if you have a great vision if you don't have the money, or if you've got a great vision and the money, but you can't operate.
Right.
So this is classical. And what I've been working on the last year or so is building what we call in computer science and ontology, saying how do risk factors feed into this? And like I said, this was from my observation that when I was teaching cybersecurity risk, it's like I was teaching only part of the picture. And I wasn't looking at the impact. And now I tell my students first day, you say risk, you say impact. And now since I've been talking to Bill, you say risk, tell me impact, and tell me your actions that's going to resolve that. Because again, in the pandemic, the probability is very small. The impact was huge. Hurricane Harvey, I love it when they say that was a 1 in 800 year event. And I always say, then why did it happen in my lifetime? It could have happened 700 years from now. I don't care. How come we've had 3 of those events in my neighborhood in the last 5 years? But let's leave that question, right? So another aspect of this, and I am watching the time here, is when we talk about stakeholders. And I'm going to, I can't take this to tax, but let me tell you something I'm involved in now. We at the university is trying to figure out how we're going to operate amid a pandemic, how we're going to reduce the risk to our faculty, to our students, but yet we're going to provide a value of education. Of course, there's always a revenue risk. What if we give classes and nobody shows up, right? And we talk about stakeholders. Stakeholders aren't necessarily clients. They're customers. I have a philosophy that my students aren't my customers. My customer for the product I produce out of A&M is society and the taxpayers of Texas, that underwrite A&M. But who are the stakeholders? And that's what enterprise risk management is giving us now. How do we identify, measure, manage all the risk to those stakeholders? And if I could digress, Bill, if I get too far off, just tell me. I worked on deWitte.
Keep going.
Okay, about 6 years ago, I worked on, 8 years ago, wow, 2012, I worked on Deepwater Horizon for about 6 months. And I was going through documents to look for scientific reasons about if you remember Deepwater Horizon that occurred when the well exploded, 11 lives were lost, billions of dollars in damage and all this. And we looked at the stakeholders, and I created a theory, and I should have published a paper on it. I actually put this in a patent application for my Norwegian client, and I don't think it went anywhere. It's one aspect. And I realized that there's a different class of stakeholders too. The first are the people that are primarily impacted. And the stakeholders, I should say, who are responsible. Let me put it this way. They're responsible. So in something like Deepwater Horizon, we could say BP, Transocean, whoever. And then there's the stakeholders, and we look at stakeholders, as I said, risk and impact, but we don't look at the kind of the ontology of the stakeholders. What happened after that is what's going to happen, I think, in the virus. You have an immediate impact. You have people who are affected who may not have been in the decision makers. They might have been the business entities. They're the people who's lost their jobs. There's all that immediate impact. But then what I think people miss in stakeholders is what's a longer term impact. So for instance, I'm ExxonMobil. I'm another oil company. I didn't have anything to do with Deepwater Horizon. I'm not responsible. And I say we as a corporate entity or I. But I'm impacted by long-term regulations and changes. So part of what I see in stakeholders is we have to spend more time saying, who are the stakeholders? And when we take that long-term impact, I'm working on something now, if I could, on robots, using robots in pandemics, and people not liking certain things about using it in surveillance and privacy. And I pointed this out to my principal investigator, who's a robotics expert, that, I can't even begin to be 1/10 of what she knows. She knows more in a coma, I think, than I know my best day of my life about robots, especially disaster robots. But I pointed this out to her. There's this baseline of what happened before. Then there's this occurring, and as the pandemic goes on, sustaining. And then there's, if and when the pandemic ends, there's going to be this immediate impact, and then there's going to be this long-term impact. And that's what I think we're missing in risk. It's easy to say there's a probability that's happening. This is the impact. But as Bill pointed out to me in our conversation last weekend about actions, those actions change over time and who they affect. Comments, questions? Am I off base here? Or? So when I taught this last fall, I talked about 8 factors that shape this. And you're going to know more about this. The 2008 financial crisis scrutiny, what came out of the corporate accounting fraud, what came out of Enron, what came out of this and the other. every time a bad event happens, somebody like me loses sleep because I'm like, oh, could we have predicted that? How would we have collected data better? The Dr. Fauci problem. I think I'm going to now call that the Dr. Fauci problem. Because you're a cat, you're right and wrong at the same time.
Yeah.
How would you have predicted that? And let me go back to what I said. You can accept, avoid, mitigate, transfer risk. Where did we fail? Quick example, Facebook. No risk manager who probably makes hundreds of thousands a year at Facebook 5 or 6 years ago ever said, hey, Mark, bad idea to let companies scrape data like Cambridge Analytica. Yeah. Because in the US, that was not illegal, but your reputation's going to take a hit. And worse than that, you're going to lose $5 billion in one day in your stock value. No one, we're hearing now, well, they predicted this pandemic and they said this and they said that. I think we need to spend time. Then why, either did we not listen or we're in denial? And I see this in tax too. I'm not just talking things you can't apply to what you're doing. You're going to use the same tools I do. You're going to be depending on people like me to say, here's the theory of risk. Here's the theory of stakeholders. Here's the data analytics. Go out and don't make mistakes. Right? And so what we lost in some of this was when Hurricane Katrina hit. Again, this was a 1 in 400 year, and why weren't we prepared, and why? And my prediction is we're going to see this in COVID-19. And let's go back to what I said. Risk is probability of a loss to an asset. The probability of pandemic might have been very small. And at one time we would have said, well, then why are we worried about it? Then we said, because the impact can be devastating. And as Bill has pointed out to me, and sent me down on this path, and now the third leg of that stool is, what were the actions to prevent that impact? The tsunami, whenever that was, 20 years ago, very small probability you're going to have a tsunami in the Pacific. 100,000 people died. Large impact. Could we have prevented the tsunami? No. Could we have prevented the pandemic? I don't know. I don't want to get in that discussion. Could we have done things, or could we prevent a hurricane or how climate change? I don't want to get in that discussion. I want to get into the discussion of how do we, as better tools to serve the community that depends on risk. And that includes you as tax professionals. I won't talk much about this. The Basel Accords probably could, as you all could tell me more than I know. I only put this slide up here because these are significant. If you go back to my top 8 before I added the 2 in red, significant events that changed our thinking of risk. And what came out of the Basel Accords, which were 2001, was we started looking more at operational risk. How does it affect the operations? Enron, how does that affect the operations? Deepwater Horizon, part of the analysis I did is I did a timeline, and I found that something like 18 months, I think, or 24 months before that accident happened, the poor policy decisions affected the risk. They made mistakes 18 to 24 months before. This was not something that just happened that day in April of 2010, I believe. You had a timeline. And so as a risk practitioner, how do I look at that timeline now and figure out those poor decisions? And the only way you're going to get a corporation or somebody to listen to is to say, you did this, and here's a risk. Here's the potential impact. Somebody at BP could have said, and if this happens, you're going to lose billions of dollars. You're going to have 20-some lawsuits. You're going to get fined by the government. People are going to hate your name, right? So the Basel Accords, it increased the scope of that. And it brought up that whole notion of enterprise risk in the financial sector, but we still don't have a good benchmark. The way I talk about cybersecurity risk, I wouldn't begin to talk to you about that. I would not begin because it's not pertinent to your domain. I would start talking about the NIST controls and 853 standards and high, moderate, and low, and you'd be like, yeah, this is interesting as you edge toward the door, right? Another big event in our risk posture was 9/11. And I was telling Bill, I was living in Austin, running U.S. operations for an Israeli company at that time. And I was in the high-tech community there. And I knew a woman whose company was a great little small company, less than 20 people, Austin, Texas, PhD mathematician. She did some kind of financial derivatives. 9/11 put her out of business. She lost her business. And that was because 100% of her clients were in the Twin Towers. She lost her entire customer base. If someone had said to her, something bad could happen in New York, there's a risk, I'm sure she would have thought, what could be so bad? I mean, what would be the impact? I'm in Austin. I got a great staff. I got a great product. I'm going along. So as the Basel Accords made us start looking more at operational risk, September 11th said, we need a better integrated approach to risk management. We need to look at the complexity of risk. Look what happened after 9/11. We had an event. We had changes in the market. Again, we had changes in the law. We have long-term impacts that we feel 20 years later. We changed our ethics. This is when I go back to what I'm doing on the robots, on the disasters and pandemic. In the long term, short term, we reacted. We passed the U.S. Patriot Law. We're going to do this and this. And then a couple of years later, we said, yeah, we're going to let some of those provisions sunset. That's not really who we are as Americans. So, and then Katrina came, and Katrina basically said, what's the worst case that can happen? You got all these people stranded, you can't mobilize, you got this and this, and I don't care. It's like when people tell me Hurricane Harvey is 1 in 100 years. I said, when I'm trying desperately to save things in my house, as water's gushing in through the walls and the floors, and I mean, it was like, there's an old science fiction movie in the 50s called The Blob. That's what I felt like, but it was a blob, but the blob was coming in everywhere. I don't care if it's a 1 in 800 years. Why? I was told low risk. House is never flooded. This neighborhood's never flooded. Didn't flood in Allison, didn't flood in all these other severe rain events. And I took that to the bank. Now, would I have prepared differently? I don't know, because I'd never been in a flood. What was the impact? A substantial damage to my house, loss of personal belongings. What's my actions now? Now I have actually a room above my garage, which is in this neighborhood because I live in a neighborhood of mid-century modern homes. I have a place to go. I have a little refrigerator up there. I have this plan B. Same thing now with COVID-19. We're going to see what was the risk, what was the impact, what's the consequences. Ask yourself, what are you going to do to protect yourself in the future? And we're going to, as risk practitioners, we're going to go back to our little cubby holes and say, how do we do a better job predicting this? How do we do this? As Bill pointed out, it doesn't build confidence in people and your stakeholders when one day you say, hey, if you stay in Houston, like they told us in Houston, if you hunker down this time, we're going to flatten the be okay. Now we're with a hot spot, right? It doesn't help when they say, no, you don't have to wear a mask. And it's like, no, wear that mask. Get that mask on. It doesn't help when they say, you can't get it from surfaces. Oh, yes, you can. It doesn't build confidence and it doesn't lead to us wanting to be part of the solution.
Paula, let me break in here. First of all, I want to ask you about Deepwater Horizon. I'm very interested in, you went back through the history and you saw that there were, so if you're going to ask the question like, the probability of Deepwater Horizon is low, except now that you've gone back through the history, maybe the probability wasn't low at all because you've identified these points in time that really magnified, I don't know if it magnified the impact because you did the analysis or the probability or both, okay? And so it just seems that the approach to risk is always this binary question, okay, what's the risk? What's the probability? It's low, it's high, that's it. It seems to be much more nuanced when you go back through the history, and I wondered what is actionable for you as a risk practitioner based on that. And then my follow-up is I'm going to bring a tax issue and try and, apply what you're saying, on a tax issue and talk about that. I'll do the tax and you do the risk. But anyway, I was
good. That's a good way.
Yeah. What is going on? What are you, on that Deepwater Horizon? That's fascinating. But I bet nobody ever said, before I say whether it's small or high, that is the probability, I ought to go back and look at this history because Dr. Paula has said that this was important. Oh my God.
Why did they not think 18? Now, and I've tried to analyze this from several perspectives. One is I think it was different people at different times. The other is an ethical question. We see, remember when I said if you talk to data scientists, they're talking geek speak, and you don't want to hear geek speak. You want to hear, how do I do it? There's an ethical question where people would bring this up, but they weren't listened to because it was about the schedule and the budget. Deepwater Horizon had lost their first drilling rig in a hurricane. They were behind budget, behind schedule, and they were looking at, we got to get it done. We got to bring it in under budget. And so they neglected to look, and it was cascading. I mean, it was almost to the point of being comical, except it wasn't funny. They had the dead man switch didn't work because the batteries were dead, right? Where the guy went to pull to try to stop everything. They didn't let the concrete properly dry before they started it, but that was during the operation itself, the operation. Right. But this other is, I think a lot of times they're not, the technical people don't know how to communicate. And let me give you another example. When the Challenger blew up, was the Challenger the first one, and the cycle? There is actual video. The people are talking to the engineers, and the engineers are trying to tell them a problem with the O-rings. And I can find this if you want, because I built an ethics module for our engineering students. And one of the managers turns to the young engineer and says, take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. No, and that's why I tell my students, that's when you leave the room, right? I mean, we freeze it. We freeze it when we teach and say, look, this could be your dad, this could be you, they're in this discussion. It was like, yeah, I know what you're telling me technically, that these O-rings are bad, if you remember what blew up the Challenger, yeah. But put on your management hat. We want to go to space. We need to do this. We're under schedule. We're under budget. This would be embarrassing. And I think that's an inherent conflict is between your technical and your business operations, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I was going to add that if I was in the room with you as representing management, I'd stand up and say, this person was dead wrong. That isn't putting on your management hat. That's putting on some other hat, like the stupid hat.
Exactly. That's putting on your management hat. Oh, bad things can't happen to us. And
yeah, right. You would think that a good senior manager, business manager would say, hold on, bad things can happen. We got to listen to the engineers a bit here, not, browbeat them about the bottom line. But that's my view. And you talk about ethics. That's what, I try and talk to students about as well, is that you got to bring these ethical elements in and make a stand if need be. Now, on the tax example, we do have a thing in my neck of the woods on intercompany pricing, but here's the deal. You're familiar with saving for a rainy day. Okay, so why do you do that? Well, you never know what's going to happen in the future. It's good to have a little backup, right? And so I think that's what you have, is you have your little hut or whatever you called it that you can escape to in the next flood. So it's like a tree stand, maybe, as I was imagining it. So anyway, you're familiar with that concept. And we have one of those in tax, which is if you set up a tax arrangement, correct, they can be risky in the sense that the tax authority will not agree with you. Okay? So the tax authority may say, no, we don't agree with the position you've taken, and we're not going to give you the benefit, whether it be a deduction or income or whatever. We're not going to give you the benefit. And if that's the case, depending on how risky, you're obligated for financial reporting to put reserves on your financial statements, and the reserves are the saving for a rainy day. Should the IRS audit you and make that determination, you've saved for the rainy day. You've put the income aside to pay the tax dollars. Does that make sense?
Yeah. You have a plan B. This is the way I look at it. You have a plan B.
Right.
Plan A is this is going to be kosher. This is going to be okay. But if it's not okay, I got my plan B. Right.
And it's interesting that for accounting purposes, for public, for market financial reporting to the markets, you're an investor. You're supposed to report these types of risks, right? And so you're obligated to do so. So it's interesting that, even in accounting, this issue, is coming up, and you cannot put, as I say, on the books, the total benefit. You're going to have to carve it back by the amount that you save for the rainy day. Now, what typically happens is that you got to figure out, well, what's the amount I got to set aside for the rainy day? Now, remember the tension. The more I set aside for the rainy day, the less earnings I have to report to the street. Everything else fixed, okay? So you have this tension, like it's kind of like your the O-ring thing. Well, you put on your management hat. I mean, the more we put on reserve, the less profit we have, and it looks like we're not managing the company effectively. No, you goof. We are adjusting for risk. So we are managing, the company effectively. So you get into this tension, this debate. So when you go to figure out how much you ought to set aside, it's often, as you talked about in risk, it's the benefit, there are various possibilities of what the government will say. Let's say there are 3, okay? And then you probability weight it. And then you use that kind of general approach to get how much to set aside for a rainy day. So if it's high risk, right, you put more aside. If it's low risk, you put less aside. So now the management hat goes on. So you do all this analysis, and then, and I mentioned this to you earlier, you do all this analysis, and then people change it because they don't like the result. That's too much. That's too little, whatever. So then it all gets manipulated again in a way that it makes people feel good that are in charge. And, that becomes the number. Well, that was my experience, from my business background. I'm sure we could find a black swan event where one person, did it correctly. What I'm affirming is that the same, like in this example of setting aside money for a rainy day, it's the same set of steps that we can go through that you are thinking about. But my specific question is, you can do all this risk analysis and have probabilities and states of the world, what could happen. We have 3 or 4 happenings and we weight them with probabilities, but then you never see that it's been manipulated 19 times before it's reported. And I wonder, that is my specific question on all this risk management and mitigation. We see a lot of people, as you said, manipulate the results after the fact, to get their management hat on, if you will. So it's a problem, and I don't know how to solve it. It's like this. You remember Al Gore in the lockbox? You'll remember this. You and I can remember this. So it's like we need to let the accountants and the people like you go into a room, do an honest assessment, and they put it into the data analytic lockbox. That once they've done it, they got to put it there, and that's the answer. They can't touch it, review it,
change it.
Try and extend it, manipulate it. And I think a lot of this analysis suffers from that. It's just not reliable. I'll use the word, a data analytics term. It's not reliable because nobody knows where the heck it came from. It isn't
it's not traceable, and you can't.
Yeah, it's not traceable. So anyway, I'll be quiet and get your reaction.
No. And let me add to that problem. Somebody's going to manipulate the results, but also you have the problem of, if you remember when I guest lectured the class you were in this summer, we have 5 steps. We set up the project, we do this, we do this, we do this, we do this. The one I always put in red is your data. Clean and validate and trace your data.
Right.
We have a big problem in where we get our data. And how valid is that data? And it doesn't mean the same thing in context. If I'm an international tax person and I'm not, I'm the data analyst assigned to help you guys, but I don't know anything about international tax. And and a silly example would be different currencies, but build on that maybe the value of different currencies, or people make mistakes in decimal points or something like this. The valid of the data, and this is again going back to the Fauci problem, Dr. Fauci problem. Where was that data coming from? Was the data set complete? No, he was operating off incomplete data.
Right.
But he had to.
Yeah.
How do we validate that data? The thing I'm looking at on this, surveillance and privacy of the robots, we're gleaning it from blogs, newspaper articles, social media. Well, it's already biased. But what we're doing is we're actually proposing to build a better system to do this. And bring up risk to things like surveillance, to privacy, to public safety, all these things that if you start, as my robotics friend says, you're basically flying a weed whacker in the air, do people understand this? So you talk about the data on the back end is my point, and being, I'm not happy with your result, give me a better answer. But
right.
What is the answer? Well, I don't like it. Okay, all right. What answer do you want? But then on the other end, I can give you an answer, and how confident am I that I've started at the right place? And then I've run all my fancy tools on my AI and my data analytics, and I've built great visualizations, and that's an issue we have too, is people in my world, what do most people that are data scientists, data analytics like to do? They like to get in on the code. They like to build the code. They like, just give me the data. Just give me the data. Let me build it. Oh, look what I can do with it. Hey, did you notice that there's this happens and this happens at the same time, or this happens, or do you notice that you've got this clustering that we didn't realize? All of that depends on the validity of the input data. That's one rule in computers that hasn't changed since I started. Garbage in is garbage out. It's not always garbage, but it might not be complete data. It may not be clean data. It may not be valid data, but it may be the best data you have at the time. So I've given you the best answer I can, and that answer may change. And that's the Dr. Fauci problem. The answer changed because the data changed.
The answer changes. So let me ask a few lightning round questions. And after we do 2 of these, we'll say, hey, do people have any questions? And we'll see. So if you have some questions, start typing. And while you're typing, I'll ask Dr. Paula a question. First of all, so what you're saying is, Dr. Paula, is that when it comes to privacy, because you're talking about data, and often it's about data on people, so we have to give up on privacy in order to do better data analytics so we can get answers to deal with these maybe low-risk events with big impact. So privacy goes out the window. Yes, no, or I'm full of baloney.
It depends. See, that's the lawyer answer. It depends. I'll tell you what the risk is. I've got the robot, and I'm using it for something. But what if I pick up something happening that I wasn't intending to? Is that a violation of privacy? Or where does that data go? Now I've got this robot, and it's flying around the crowds. In 2 states, they used robots like bullhorns. They would go over crowds, disperse, social distance. And then people but what's that robot doing? Are they taking our picture with facial recognition? Does it go in, are they running it against all this other stuff? What people forget is, if you go back to President Trump's national emergency order and you read it, and there's certain parts of privacy that are by statute given up. A lot of your HIPAA is given up. There's a little exception in HIPAA in case this happens, right? So again, the public's not aware what is privacy. That's why I always ask my class, can anybody define it? Because we don't have a legal definition, That's the biggest concern of privacy. What data am I collecting on you or a group of people? What conclusions am I making from flying these robots over in the pandemic? And what am I going to do with that data? Where's that data going to go? Where's it going to be stored? I had this issue this week. I had to get an accommodation to teach online, even though I was already teaching online at A&M. We won't even go there. And I went back and said, you guys, who's seen this data? Where are you storing this data? You all aren't HIPAA compliant. You're asking for stuff you shouldn't be asked for. And they're like, you're a pain, Paula. And I was like, well, that's what you pay me for. That's what the privacy issues are.
No.
It's what are we picking up and what's going to happen to it? And, there's always this big fear of government. Let me give you one other risk is public safety. We haven't done it in the U.S., but in other countries, they're flying drones and putting disinfectant down the streets.
Oh, really? Nice.
That sounds like bad idea, real bad idea. I don't just like, no. What are you spraying that I'm going to be breathing in,
Right.
We identified 7. I can't remember off the top of my head, but public safety was a big one. Surveillance. What are you surveilling? How are you surveilling it? Privacy. And then it all gets to the ethics. In China, for instance, and I know this isn't to do with tax, but in China, they don't have privacy. You're a socialistic country, you got no rights. In the U.S., we had robotics response teams saying, well, they're doing this in China. Should we do it here? That's the worst reason to do something, is because somebody else is doing it.
Right.
It doesn't fit here, and it's not within our laws. And if it's in with our laws, it's within our ethics. So it's going to be an interesting study. I'll keep you informed. Oh, and let me give you one bias on data. We were picking up from news reports, social media, blogs, and things like that, but only in English.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So right there, I've got bias in my data. Now, we did this to try to get funding to do a bigger study, but I had them put that in the proposal. Our data's got to be biased. It's only in English. So if something's coming out of China or some of these other countries and it doesn't get translated into concerns and risk, we're not picking up in our current data collection. So right there, that's where my data is incomplete.
So the last kind of lightning round question, and then, we'll see if anybody's written anything in. I don't know. Josh, do we have any questions?
Not just yet.
Oh, what?
What? Well, I got one. So the bridge between data, quickly between data analytics and all this risk, I'll just say is prediction. And that gets us into artificial intelligence, algorithms, machine learning, all this stuff where you can really beat the heck out of historical data and really forecast. Now, you may not know what the causal links as opposed to correlations. You may not know the causal links, but you got a model that predicts pretty well. However, we find that there are certain problems because the data can change. It may not be reliable. We don't know where it came from. So why should we not take a real negative view that maybe to solve the risk issue, data is not where it's at. We're not sophisticated enough in terms of our use or understanding of data to really have a Dr. Fauci go out and talk about stuff that's going to change on a daily basis. I mean, is that a path that maybe people are thinking about? We've got to have a reframe. It's got to be some other technology besides statistics or data.
And that's a really good point, especially in the pandemic. I've heard from a friend of mine in Galveston who's married to a doctor, head of trauma at UTMB, saying he should only talk about doctor stuff. He's talking about stuff he doesn't know. Right. In my perspective, and again, I don't want to criticize him because I think I wouldn't want his job. Right. We don't have an understanding in the public about data and statistics. So when he says something, it's kind of like, in statistics, you have different distributions, right? Right. And he's talking about, okay, here's the thing, we're doing this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. That's always within some bounds of confidence. How confident are you in that data? Now, it's a catch-22 because if he starts talking about that, people are going to be, I don't know what you're talking about. The public wants answers. When is this going to be over? What is this going to do? Am I going to be one affected? Kind of like that. So I think that there's, first of all, a lack of public understanding on the data. And then the problem with technologies like AI, machine learning, any of these fancy schmancy analytics we're using now is there's always assumptions and bias built into them. Right. Artificial intelligence is typically heuristics, which means it's not an algorithm. It can give you different answers on the same data set. There's a book called Algorithms of Oppression where they went through and they had machine learning on all these data sets. They did all these, I think Amazon spent tens of millions of dollars wanting to build this one system. And what people will say is, and this is where misunderstanding the data comes in, oh, you didn't train it on the right data sets. If you trained it only on white males, then yeah, it's only going to give you white males as your answer. This one particular case, Amazon shut the program down because they could not figure out why the data was coming out biased. Right. And they just our reputation, what they were trying to do is they were trying to build this AI system to go out on the internet and look for potential employees so they could snag them. And they were getting disproportionate numbers, and Amazon basically said, our reputation, we don't want to be the headlines of being racist or something or whatever. They couldn't figure it out. And those are some pretty smart people. So the whole notion of AI, it's not magic. It's still crunching numbers. Where do those numbers come from? How valid are they? And who coded it? Who coded it?
Dr. Paula, we have a question.
Oh, good.
Read it.
Yes. So how do you address the situation of management manipulating the data to the point that they change the risk as opposed to addressing the risk as it exists?
Oh, that's a good one.
Oh, that is a good one. So let me make sure I got that. How do you address the point of management manipulating the risk, right? Is that it? Instead of addressing the risk. If I'm on the team.
Can it be that? Say it again, Josh. Just repeat it. It's a great question.
How do you address the situation of management manipulating the data to the point that they change the risk as opposed to addressing the risk as it exists?
That is such a good question. Let me tell you some of the pitfalls in this, and if I'm interpreting this right. Where am I in the food chain that I'm even going to be able to affect management manipulating the data to change the risk? Let me give you an example right now. We're opening the universities. We're looking at the data. We're not seeing it for what it is, right? I can't go to the provost and say, I disagree with that, right? Because it's not going to happen. If I, as a practitioner, I document as much as I can why I got to where I got to and traceability of data. So I can try to say, this is why your analysis is wrong. You manipulate the data and you manipulate the risk. Okay, let's think of all the bad things that can happen. BP, Deepwater Horizon, right? Give you these things. But it's a hard problem because of lack of power of people that may know the right answer, being able to actually affect management. And that's just the way it is. That's not going to go away, unfortunately. But the way I attack it is, I'm telling you everything I've done. Here's my traceability. Here's why I think I'm doing what I'm thinking. And here's the risk to you if you make the wrong, if you take another analysis.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that real quick, arguably, can the manipulation create risk, a different type of risk that management, they're dealing with something originally. The manipulation leads to another risk that isn't really identified. Instead, we're all focused on the original one.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay. Yeah.
100%. I would say the classic example is Facebook selling the data. Now.
Oh, okay. The scraping.
Yeah, you can scrape the data. Do we as consumers, we're not paying for this. Who owns the data? The problem is, in my book, it goes to an organizational issue. Facebook is not a social media company. It's a data company. It has a lot of data. It's making its money selling that data, right? From their viewpoint, hey, you're using it for free, so it's our data. Who owns the data? But so they created a lot more risk for themselves that they claimed they didn't foresee. They were really kind of surprised people were upset by this. But again, I wouldn't want to be in their shoes because they have such a massive platform with so many users that selling the data was one thing. Now trying to go in and figure out all the hate speech, that's an unwinnable problem.
Well, Dr. Paula, this was fascinating. Thank you. I apologize. I got so excited. I talked more than I should have. Oh, apparently we have one question, and then Josh, I need you to put the slide.
Is there an email address that I can add on here for people to see that they can send you any questions they may have?
You know what? Sure. I didn't think about that. My first name dot last name, and just remember it's DEWITTE @TAMU.edu. Yeah, sorry I didn't put that on there. I usually have it on the slides, and I cut slides out. Yeah.
And Josh, can you put up the second slide, take control of the screen, and I'll tell people what's coming up next, and we'll be done.
Yes. And I'll read you that question real quick while I do that.
Okay, great.
How can risk from individuals who refuse to follow basic rules or procedures and with bigger negative impact on others be managed?
We've tried that, right? In COVID-19, this is where somebody's saying, I'm not going to wear a mask. If that's what I understand. I'm saying I'm assuming the risk, but I'm actually increasing your risk. Am I hearing that right?
Yes.
Yes.
And we managed that badly. Threatening to fine people, doing this, doing that, didn't work. I go back to the theory of Thaler and Sunstein. If you want people to buy into things, you got to nudge them. And I think we have had a failure of leadership, and I'm not being political either party. I'm agnostic. I think anybody would have failed in this job, a failure of leadership. Nobody likes to be told what to do. I think it would have been better to have said, somehow to nudge us into wanting to wear the mask. I wear the mask. I have no problem wearing the mask. But the whole idea of personal liberty that we hold so dear and everything, you can't tell me what to do and this is government intervention. There's no legal basis for that. There's a Supreme Court ruling from 1906 that says, if I want to line you all up and give you vaccinations and you don't want a vaccination, too bad. Public safety trumps personal rights. So I think that's been a failure of leadership, where if somebody had gotten buy-in better of the public to participate as if they were part of the decision-making and not being told what to do, we would not have this blowback we have now. It all comes to involving your stakeholders.
Great. So once again, a great pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure. Again, thank you for having me.
And if in one additional minute for our remaining folks, here's what's coming up. We have tax technology and the future of tax departments. And I wanted to let everyone know that's still with us that Dr. Deborah Toledo is going to apply all the principles that Dr. Paula has discussed in terms of automating the tax department. So you're going to see an application for an hour of everything that Dr. Paula has been talking about by Dr. Toledo. So you'll want to, these kind of go together. They're a good pairing, like wine and steak, Dr. Paula. So these two are together, so you'll want to see this. And then our special treat will be with Professor William Burns on, this is a strict tax topic, FACTA, but Professor Burns is a leading expert, if not the leading expert. So you'll want to catch Dr. Burns. He is as engaging as Dr. Paula, so you'll want to get in here and see that. So with that, I thank you again, Dr. Paula. Thanks to all our listeners, and take care. We'll see you for the next webinar. Thanks again.
All right, be safe. I'll see you at these next seminars. They look good.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.